I want to talk a little bit about the learning outcomes versus the teaching for understanding, and I want to try and not go on for 3 hours um, because it is a topic where I could. But I want to leave the topic run for a little longer, maybe after the weekend, because I want to give people a chance to come up with some learning outcomes or understanding goals or something for what they're teaching. But we will come back to it again. So it's kind of six of one and half a dozen of the other. We don't need these to be perfect. We absolutely don't need them to be perfect at this point, but we do need some. Okay. And I wanted to respond to some things that have come up in the discussion thread. And certainly several people, I think, have consciously realized the difference in approach, in philosophical approach between learning outcomes and goals, understanding goals, that they're more free ranging, that they can be wider, whereas learning outcomes are more fixed and deterministic, and that's because of where they come from. And I think down there somewhere in the thread, there is a comment about learning outcomes in uh, training. Yes, there it is. It was Mary, wasn't it? It was. Um, and you probably, a lot of you are familiar with this, where learning outcomes were mentioned at the start of the course or where they were mentioned in the advertising material, but they weren't necessarily followed through apparently. And part of this is because, generally speaking, people are teaching are required to write learning outcomes, but nobody really wants to do it. Um, and um, in many cases, in large university departments, in corporate training operations, learning outcomes very often, some people will sit down at the start of the process and work out some generic learning outcomes, and then they will simply be cut and pasted across all the courses of a particular type with some slight substitutions. This is very common. And it's also the case that people were required to write learning outcomes for courses. That happened quite a while ago. It's only later, it's a subsequent development, that people have been required to write learning outcomes for whole degree programs. In theory, there should be an integration. You should have a set of learning outcomes for a degree program, and then the learning outcomes for each year and each module should fit with that. They won't all perfectly align, but certainly for any given module, the learning outcomes, you should be able to see where they fit in the big map. And that hasn't necessarily worked. For example, in CK 101, the big BA program in UCC, there are no program learning outcomes because nobody has even tried to start the discussion to get agreement across the whole arts faculty about what the learning outcomes for it should be. Trying to bypass that problem by talking about graduate attributes now. The other problem, and people remarked on learning outcomes, it can be a tick box exercise, and in some contexts, like secondary education in the UK, it's become a nightmare. It's a pure tick box operation, and it's driven people demented by the amount of paperwork that it's created. And it's a distraction and an obstacle to teaching. And of course, real teaching um, involves a certain degree of exploration. It involves a certain degree of flexibility, particularly at graduate level. It also brings in ideas like the connected curriculum, which was mentioned and which we'll come back to. Dilly Fung's work on the connected curriculum requires you to engage with the community and the world in which you live and make sure that what you're teaching in the university aligns with and serves some useful purpose in the world. And that's messy. So that's problematic in terms of writing learning outcomes. My pet peeve about writing learning outcomes, I originally put a lot of thought into writing my learning outcomes because I was doing things that were a bit innovative. And if it was clear from my learning outcomes and my assessment descriptions that I was doing weird and funky stuff, people all over the university who were reviewing these at various committee stages would have just raised objections. So my learning outcomes are very carefully worded to allow me the freedom to pursue an understanding goals, teaching for understanding style of learning without people in the bureaucracy noticing. Which means my learning outcomes are not entirely as helpful as they should be for students looking at the module description, but then who actually reads the module description? You know? So this is a problem in the whole nature in which they're involved. Learning outcomes just have so much administrative baggage. But some sort of statement of what you want people to know at the end of the course. And the roller skates example is a great one. The other example is the bicycle one. If you're teaching a course about learning riding a bicycle, what are your learning outcomes going to be? You want people to be able to get up on a bicycle and ride 50 yards on a bicycle. Your first class honors is doing wheelies on a bicycle probably. And that links to authentic assessment. So it is useful to have some kind of an idea, but the idea, you need not to be dogmatically tied to the idea. One of the most useful ones for structuring it, which is buried in there in the readings, is the relationship between learning outcomes and Bloom's taxonomy. And if you Google Bloom's taxonomy, you'll find any number of beautiful diagrams, all of which are roughly similar, which show the different levels of Bloom's taxonomy. I picked one out here. So the bottom level is knowing or remembering. That's simple. Describe, know. That's the sort of thing that can be actually assessed by a multiple choice test. And then it goes up to understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating, and creating, right, as higher levels of learning and more complicated. One of the problems with learning outcomes as they have been written, there is a tendency for learning outcomes to hover down in the first two levels of Bloom's taxonomy. And in fact, if you look at quite a lot of modules, the first one or two learning outcomes are know. Know the main features of, insert words, right? And then you get discuss or outline or, predict is an unusual one, or use or illustrate the application of this theory to a particular case study. But where it comes to create, imagine, design, rare enough. Because those are harder to assess, right? So that's an issue. But certainly any version of Bloom's taxonomy, and some of them have quite a lot of words and suggestions. I suspect this one may work. Let's open this in a new tab and have a look. Will give you a lot of well, it's not a lot of verbs, but it's certainly some questions. Can the student justify a stand or decision? And some of those would apply on some of the things that you're thinking about designing. The creative ones, the communications ones, the interlinguistic, intercultural communication. Even things like Reese is talking about video games. Can you justify the use of a particular video game in teaching a particular topic? So that may help you to shape those up in almost every case. So those are some of the things there. Several people are still thinking around, okay? And that's fine. That's actually very good. Because one of the problems with learning outcomes is that you get a set of boilerplate learning outcomes and you go, right, I have to write these. I'm just going to cut and paste some words in here and change, the student will know, insert my own stuff, boom, done, without any thought. So going through the process of thinking explicitly on paper is actually useful. And there's at least possibly 3 or 4 of you who are doing that, and that's good. It's good that you're comfortable doing that in this discussion, and everybody should feel comfortable doing that. I want to come back up here. There was a couple of things occurred to me. Barry, there is a thing. Dominic's already made a suggestion which is very good, and I would also suggest that you look up CVE, Countering Violent Extremism, which is a thing. Very small number of specialist scholars and consultancy groups do it. They don't advertise widely, but there's a minimum of literature on it, and a lot of it is geared towards countering violent extremism on the web. So that's one that you can look up. A note of caution is in terms of how far down the rabbit hole of people's personal feelings you go, because you don't want to get into teaching stuff that's going to trigger people too much, or put yourself in the role of having to deal, be their counselor as well as their teacher. Okay. For this course, it's fine. We're theoretically creating a course that may or may not be delivered, so it doesn't matter too much how far down that road you go, but it's certainly something to kind of have there in terms of if it was a course you are actually delivering in a university, they would have concerns about that. You could think as well, there's this sort of pathway of being alert, which you mentioned, to the things that will lead someone who's frustrated into, negative action on the web and digital violence as well as physical. So there's that. The other thing, of course, that you could explore is what are the ways and methods through which, if you're fed up with the state of the world, you can direct that into positive action rather than negative. So there could be a section there that says what are the gateways and the pathways from fed up with the world to doing something to make the world a better place. You create your own reality. I keep saying this to people. Um, and they go, that's weird, really. You don't create your own reality. But then I take the example of the person kicking, in rugby, and they're kicking a penalty, and they stand back and they look at the posts and they look at the ball and they're imagining something in their mind. And then if they're really good, they can take 3 steps back, take a deep breath, and they can enforce their vision into reality. And that's magic. And you can do that. Anyway, that's a little digression. So that is certainly there. Reese, video games, a lot of stuff on reading for video games and on the use of video games, some of which is also coming up in the gaming stuff. So there's plenty to look at there. And you threw up the roller skates. How do you... one of the problems with learning games and using video games in learning is that games designed specifically for learning are boring. But you could have a look at what Kurt Squire has written. He has written stuff on using civilization to teach world history. That is the starting point. It was his PhD thesis in about 2004. And that is his experiences using civilization to teach world history, and an awful lot of his work flows from that. So there's a rich vein there to think about. Lorraine is working on a topic, but a lot of it's about digital learning, which is fine. So a topic will emerge from that. Honor, yes, right. This is the creative thinking. There's the creative thinking and there's the multicultural communication, which are kind of similar, okay, in that they do require people to think. They're hard things to teach. They're abstract things. There are things that apply to both of them that you could think about in terms of, well, I don't know how easily they translate into learning outcomes, but there is the literature on design thinking, because the first part of design thinking is deep observation and understanding of the target group and their problem. And that would apply both to this and it would apply to the intercultural communication thing, because learning how to communicate in new cultures requires, observing and understanding how the culture works. And that's not just multilingual, although that course is targeted at language learning and it's targeted as a long-term, lifelong learning experience. But also, if you're doing new product development across language groups, you're also going to be involving different technical specializations. Engineers, marketing people, the financial analysts, they all speak different languages as well. So getting them to communicate together is important. And to a certain extent, that falls back here to the creative thinking course, because the best creativity occurs when you have diverse teams. There is literature on diversity. I'll bring some of it into the communities of practice later on, where people have clearly demonstrated how more diverse teams produce more creative results and better management. It's been done. The research is solid. But again, it's this whole diversity. And diversity brings benefits, but it brings communication problems. And that would apply to both of these. So that would be something, you've got knowing the client, knowing the model, knowing the different language groups. Those fit in there. There's Mary O'Sullivan's right, yes. And there are some learning outcomes in that, which is great. And you see, that's Mary's second post, isn't it? The first post was looking for stuff, and the second one is getting it together, and that's exactly why the process thinking aloud on paper is good. The narrow, I love the deep narrow well and the wide shallow pond. I am a wide shallow pond teacher. Yeah, very definitely. I do not do so well on the deep narrow wells, which is why I prefer understanding goals, I think. And yes, teaching for understanding can spiral off in many directions, and one of the reasons why I had to be very careful about how I wrote my course descriptions was in order to make sure that I had the room to spiral off if a class went in an interesting direction. So I have a body of content. We have like 12 weeks in most courses. I have a body of content which is essential that we can get through in about 8 or 9. And I always have 2 or 3 weeks of, yeah, we can, shuffle around there and do interesting stuff. So I'm willing to sacrifice coverage for some depth and some better understanding, which learning outcomes as an approach just doesn't facilitate that, to my mind, unless you are very subversive about it. Now, explore the general digital engagement. Okay, so digital engagement, actually, yes, it's amazing how many people are coming up with topics, because digital engagement is not a million miles different from Barry's questions about online ideological violence. They all include aspects of the digital, and they involve engagement with it. So they are, on the one level, very different. One is very general, one's quite specific. They would go together nicely as a pair. So let me just read here. How do we click the like, dislike, the connected curriculum? That's the second dimension of connected curriculum. Excellent. Maybe I should drag that in sooner. Maybe people are ready to read about Dilly Fong. And right, again, haven't quite decided yet. That's fine. Okay. But really, and you don't have to, you see, the thing about this is that we are designing a course in this course. And at the end of it, you do want to have some idea what the course is going to be about. You need, at this stage, you need an area, right? You need a topic. And I'd like people to come up with 2 or 3 learning outcomes or understanding goals, or a generative question that fits with that topic. More will emerge as we step through the building activities and how to build assessments and things, okay? But this is why I want to let this discussion run on till the weekend, maybe, because I do want people to try and get at least a general concept, those of you that don't have one yet. And as I say, 2 or 3 things that look faintly like they could pass for a learning outcome or an understanding goal. And then we can move along to polish and refine those as we go. And at the end of the process, you can then come back and rewrite them all. So it's just a work in progress. But I'm very happy with the way in which people are taking a deep dive on the meaning behind what they want to create, and that allows you to do a much better sort of job of doing it, rather than just going, oh yeah, I've got to teach a course on the origins of the French Revolution, right? 1 textbook, 5 learning outcomes that I cut and paste from somewhere else, off you go, boom. Those courses are easy, right? These are more interesting because they're more challenging. If you can build these, you can build the easier ones. Although you might find building the easier ones a bit boring, but hey, that's life. We get paid for doing that sometimes. I'm so fortunate. I've got to a situation where I get paid for doing stuff that isn't at all boring. So there we go. I've got to remember where the stop button is here.